Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. That groove you hear behind me, that's the handiwork of the band Soulive. And if you're hearing it for the first time, then I envy you. Because I remember how great I felt the first time I heard this record. I mean, I have to dig deep, almost 20 years back into my memory cave to find that, but it's there. I was so happy to discover this band, the way they brought together elements of jazz and soul and hip-hop. Because, so many of us grew up with multiple input streams, and it's hard when you have to choose just one lane. So I really appreciated how they brought it all together. Soulive has gone through various iterations and phases, but at their core are three members, two brothers, drummer Alan Evans and keyboard player Neil Evans, and my guest today, Eric Krasno. I had heard that the Evans brothers started to develop their sound, and when they hooked up with Krasno, who goes by the nickname Kraz, the band was born. And while that turns out to be a true story, today we get a little more of that story. Eric Krasno is certainly an established and respected guitarist. In addition to his work with Soulive, he was a founding member of the band Lettuce, along with his old pal, drummer Adam Deitch. He also works with all kinds of groups as a player, including the Tedeschi Trucks Band, Lesh and Friends, Oteil Burbridge and Friends. It's a lot of friends. And that kind of speaks to the fact that Kraz has one foot in the jam band world, that universe of extended groove and risky riffing, the constant change-up and the direct contact with a massive community following. I guess the thing, though, that surprised me about Eric is how much stuff he actually does beyond that. He's part frontman, limelight guy, and part behind-the-scenes guy. For example, he also has another foot in the world of songwriting and production, particularly in that space where soul and hip-hop meet. He's produced and written songs for a number of really cool projects and artists, including Talib Kweli, Nigel Hall, the London Souls, Marcus King, rapper 50 Cent, and even my recent guests, Lawrence. As a matter of fact, when I discovered Lawrence earlier this summer, and I talked about that on a previous episode, I had no idea that Kraz had produced their first record. And here's another fact for you. When I interviewed Victoria Canal earlier this year, I also had no idea that she had been working with Kraz. So it seems that he's been making the rounds with some of what I consider to be some of the most exciting young artists today. And he also puts out music as a solo artist where he sings and performs his own songs. His most recent release, Telescope, came out last year, accompanied by a series of animated videos that hold together as a kind of global narrative about the lives of a group of people who live in the same building in New York. Telescope, as it turns out, was a kind of farewell love letter to New York, where Krasno was based and where he made so much of his statement for over 20 years. Then in 2019, he moved to LA, settled down, and started his next act. And though he planned to spend most of his time producing and writing songs, he was also scheduled to play over 100 gigs this year. Then the hammer of history fell and he found himself locked down in LA. In COVID times, he's been doing his own podcast called Eric Krasno Plus One, and I hesitate to say too much about it because you might get overexcited. But he, like I do on this project, interviews musicians, producers, songwriters, and friends, and he's already talked to Don Was, John Mayer, Dave Matthews, John Schofield, and more. I mean, it is a hip collection of folks. We zoomed in last week to talk about what he's doing during these strange and trying times, his experience as a podcaster, a producer, and provider of deep and soulful grooves. Along the way, we talked about the development of Soulive, of Lettuce, of the Lure Records, the values and expectations of jam and jam band audiences, the boom bap with interesting chord changes. That's how he describes Soulive. Learning how to do less, but to do it better, and how many times one man can say the word nugget in an hour-long interview. I'd like you to try to keep track and let me know how many you find, and I've left a few Easter eggs in there for you along the way. Third-story.com is the place to go. Sign up, subscribe, get involved. Check out the episode archive where you can listen to previous episodes featuring some folks who come up in our talk today, including Victoria Canal, Lawrence, Will Lee, all the Wolfpack folks, Bob Power as well. Although he does not receive a specific name check, I think Bob Power's work is extremely relevant to this conversation. While you're there, you can also drop me a line. There's a link to all of the socials, or you can go to the Patreon page, patreon.com/thirdstorypodcast, where you can become a patron of this project. I really enjoyed talking to Kraz, and I want to give a special shout out to my friend Mark Plotkin, the talented musician, composer, producer, and educator who helped make this possible. Thank you, Mark. Without further ado, here's me and Kraz talking it down. Eric Krasno, thanks, man, for taking some time.
Absolutely. I just listened to most of the Lawrence interview. Unfortunately, I got interrupted. I'm actually moving. We're having a baby.
Oh, congratulations.
In a month. We're also moving. So it's just like a crazy time, but it's kind of, in a weird way, it's good that I don't have any touring or anything going on, so I can kind of focus on that. And also, weirdly, in the last couple of months, I've like lost awareness of days and time. So I apologize being a few minutes late there.
Oh, not at all. I mean, I think that's one of the benefits to slowing our lives down in this way, is that 5-10 minutes don't mean what they used to mean, you know?
I know. I think that's really important. I've been talking with a lot of artists about that, or just anyone in general. I mean, especially, and I don't know if I can speak for, I feel like it feels different in South America and European countries that I've spent time in, but in America, people are so career driven, including myself, where we let all these important life things become secondary. And I feel that shift was needed. Of course, the cost of like lives and all these different horrible things that have happened also, and businesses going out of business and going broke. I mean, I wouldn't have wished that on anything, but on my personal life, I've felt some positive shifts for sure, you know.
You of all people, to hear you say that, you know, we're also career oriented. It's interesting. You seem like you're kind of full on nonstop 24/7 thinking about making music, who you're going to hook up with, where you're going to be, how you're going to do it.
True. I think there's been so much that I've been able to do. I think that's another thing, honestly, in this time period, is like reflecting and being like, wow, we've done a lot of stuff, you know, like talking to my friends and, you know, kind of actually spending time being like, talking about different gigs we've done and events we've been a part of and people we've gotten to work with, and very thankful. I think gratitude is as important as anything in your life. It not only puts you in a better mood, but it also brings more to you. You know what I mean? The more gratitude you give each thing that you're doing, and the more you nurture each project. I mean, that's another thing that I think has shifted for me, is take on less, give each thing a little more.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, one thing is I'm working on an album now, and I've never made an album where the album is what I'm doing. It's always, the album is a sidebar to the 20 gigs that I'm doing, and I'm producing other people, and I'm doing this, I'm doing that. I mean, I am doing other things. I'm also doing a podcast, and I am doing some production for other people, but my album right now is my priority, and I've never had that. I mean, with Soulive back in the day, we would do that, but honestly, it would still be between tours, and this is the first time I've been able to really just focus on writing my own music and producing my own music. So that's been really great. I'm spending the time on each song and really giving it the attention that I may not have given in the past. I think part of it is like, you got to make money, you got to pay your bills. And then it's also just trying to achieve as much as you possibly can. For me, as I've gotten older, I've started to maybe appreciate the process a bit more too. And it's not just about getting to the finish line. You know what I mean? When you're younger, you're like, I need to do this, I need to finish that, I need to do this. And now I'm like, ooh, cool. Like, mixing this is fun.
Yeah, right.
You know, like, I can spend a little more time on each thing. And I think there's a lot of different, part of it is I have my own studio. On this record, I'm working with another producer, but you know, there's no timeline really. I'm trying to get it done, but I don't really have a label hanging over my head saying it has to be done by this date, which can be good and bad. But I'm trying to impose my own deadlines. But I think that it's a combination of a lot of things, but I feel like in a really good place creatively. I'm not rushing.
Over the last couple of days, as I've been kind of like swimming through as much of your output in your career as I could, I discovered Telescope, your last record that you made, as a solo record. And I didn't know it, and it was a real pleasant surprise to find it.
Yeah, not a lot of people know it.
That's what I realized. I mean, you know, you can just get a sense that whatever happened, it just didn't reach the people that it could have.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say that to me that have heard it.
Yeah.
You know, well, one thing was it was a concept album that was very much story driven. The biggest thing is I didn't tour behind it.
Yeah.
I was playing a lot with Oteil and Phil Lesh and being an MD for a lot of things, and I was producing other people's things. So I was so busy, and honestly, it was a little bit of a hard album to recreate. You know, I made it with a lot of production. I made it with a guy named Jeremy Most, who's a incredible producer.
Right, I know him from the Emily King records, right?
Yes, from Emily King, and Emily's on the record.
Yep.
And so it's a big departure for me. And at first I was a little bit like, okay, I'm just going to create a whole different name. I mean, it's under a different name too. If it's under the name Kraz,
Yep.
which a lot of people that know me, that's what they call me. But I kind of wanted it to be branded as a different thing.
Yeah.
I didn't think it sounded like anything else that had been come out under my name. You know, it's one of those things where people find it and it's kind of this like nugget that they find and they're like, "Oh, this, you did this." And I kind of appreciate that now. I was a little like bummed when it came out that it didn't reach as many people, but
well, it's a very labor intensive nugget. I mean, that's a lot of work to put in for something to be an afterthought.
Man. Yeah, we put a lot of work into that record and a lot into like the animation and the whole art piece. It was also just it was a tall order for the listener, because it was like, okay, there's this storyline, but it's all like kind of hidden in these songs, and the animation kind of brings you into it. But my new record is kind of like a hybrid between my first album, Blood from a Stone.
Mm-hmm.
I call that my first album, but it's really just my first album singing.
Yeah.
And then that album, like my new album, is kind of I've found this like resting place between those two projects that feels really comfortable.
Why did it take you so long to start singing? You're a great singer. I mean, at some point you must have thought, I should really sing.
You know, I always considered myself a band guy, and always like I really got deep into songwriting, you know, well, I guess it's now about 15 years ago. When Soulive, I mean, I started writing probably like the early 2000s. I mean, I wrote like in high school and stuff, but I got serious into songwriting probably the early 2000s. Soulive made a record called No Place Like Soul. Mm-hmm. And we didn't really have like a lyricist, so I started like writing lyrics at that point. And then like I started demoing my own songs, and then I wrote songs for like Derek and Susan, Tedeschi Trucks Band, and I started working with a guy named Dave Gutter, who's also a great lyricist, and he and I wrote Blood from a Stone, that album. The initial idea for that album was that I would have different people singing the songs, but that I would create the music. Mm-hmm. And as I was demoing the songs and like singing them in the studio, Dave Gutter was really the one that was like, "Hey man, you should just sing this stuff." Yeah. Then Susan Tedeschi said the same thing. I played her a couple songs. She's like, "Why are you?" Because I was initially going to ask her and some other people, and she was like, "You should just sing." And I had never really thought about that. And Blood from a Stone was really my first time like singing lead at all. And then I toured behind that album, which is really where I think I started figuring it out. Because in the studio, I was kind of like, I don't know what I'm doing. And the other thing that was really interesting is I just wrote them in whatever key that the guitar felt good in, and then singing them on the record, you can tell where it's in my range or not. You know what I mean? And then later, like now when I listen to that record, I'm like, oh man, why didn't I do that in the right key? But now I've kind of started to figure it out through, it's one of those things too, where you just get out on the road and you start doing it and start singing my own songs. And then really, I feel like with the record I'm making now, I'm really figuring out where my voice is strongest, and where I kind of hit that spot where it makes sense. Because by no means am I a singer. I'm a songwriter and a guitarist that kind of sings to get the song out.
Yeah, but there's vibe and there's intention and there's all that stuff that comes across. Like the songs don't seem like they're written to be sung by some virtuosic larger than life singers. It felt real appropriate to me.
I'm starting to figure that out,
Yeah.
And I think with the new record, I know I keep talking about that because I'm recording it like literally right now.
Yeah. And who are you working with?
A guy named Otis McDonald, who is a nugget himself in terms of like not a ton of people know him, but man, this guy's amazing. He plays everything. He sings. We linked up through Adam Deitch, the drummer from Lettuce. Or actually through Will Blades too, who initially told me about him, but then Deitch kind of called me and was like, "You have to work with this guy." And he and I made a song for this charity organization called Song Aid, called "Man in Me," which is a Bob Dylan song. And that song had been in my kind of orbit everywhere I went for the past year. And I'm also like, I got married and I'm having a baby, and it was just like all these things. And I kind of wanted to do this like soulful version of that song. And when he hit me up about doing something for that. I was like, well, why don't we do that together? So I sent him like a little demo, and we made that song, and it came out so great. I just loved the vibe of it, and I was like, well, hey man, I got a lot of other songs. So we've done like 6 songs so far, and I've written probably about 13 or 14. It's cool. I mean, we're working from different I'm working at my studio, he's working at his, and then a week ago or 2 weeks ago I went up to his studio in San Francisco, with the mask and the gloves and the whole thing. But he had the studio to himself, so it was just me and him really, and we kind of hammered out some stuff, but a lot of it's been virtual, just sending tracks back and forth, FaceTime, to Zoom like this. And I never thought I'd be able to make a record that way and like effectively, but we've been able to do it, and it feels really live, and a lot of it wasn't live. It's kind of weird.
As you're describing all of this, it strikes me that for much of your career, you've been a kind of live in the room producer based in New York without, a wife and child. And now you're an LA singer-songwriter working with a different producer remotely, expecting your first child. I mean, it's like there's a lot of pivoting that has taken place.
For sure.
And what you're all of this stuff that you're describing is almost like a second act.
I mean, I feel like it was in my head, and I kind of like saw it in the distance, but it took me a while to pull the trigger and actually like move out here. And I was very entrenched in New York, although I watched a lot of things happen. When I moved to New York, it was so different. I mean, the studios were so vibrant. I was popping around to different sessions all the time. And when I left, I don't even know if there's any studios left that I were there when I started. There's still the Bunker Studios, which is like my favorite spot in Brooklyn. And I when I go back there, I work with those guys, John Davis and the Bunker crew. But other than that, all of the friends that I had there kind of moved out and moved to Denver. The Lettuce guys moved. The Soulive crew, like Neil's still in Brooklyn, but Alan was in Massachusetts. And it just didn't, it got to the point where it didn't matter. And I kind of looked around and I was like, okay, do I want to live in this little apartment and like stuff all my gear in like a storage unit? And then I shared a studio with some people and they were great, but it was just, I don't want to share my musical space. I was like, I want to be somewhere where I have space. And, you know, I always wanted to move to California. It just didn't seem possible. And my brother moved out here. I came and visited him. I'd started looking at houses and I just found this place with a recording studio in the back, and I was like, are you kidding me? You mean I could have all of this in one place? And it's like the same price as living in New York? I was like, I'll take it. It was a leap, you know, even though it had been in my head for a while, but everything has been falling into place, and it's definitely been a crazy journey, but I'm really, really glad that I made that move.
Well, it's an interesting time also, right? I mean, there are a couple of things that happen. You make the move, and then, shortly after that, we're all in lockdown, so you have a lot of time to reflect on having made that move.
Oh, yeah. I mean, once like that all hit and all my friends in New York were like fleeing, I was like, well, thank God.
Yeah.
I felt really lucky to be here and have this space and be able to create. And I just kind of was like, oh, no gigs? Damn, well, it sucks that the world's going through this, but there's like this massive list of things I've been wanting to do. Totally. Finally get to like tweak with my synthesizer for a couple days, you know what I mean? And like get like all my guitar sounds that I like together and start making a new album. And I started doing a podcast that I had kind of like jump started like a couple times, and then I was like, okay, well, now I can actually like dig in and do it. So there's a lot of things. I mean, of course, none of us are making money the way that we were before, but creatively, I feel like people are really going for it, myself included.
You talk about how you saw New York change over the last 25 years, but so let's talk about the New York that you first discovered, and even before that. I mean, did you grow up in Connecticut?
Yeah, I was in Connecticut till I was a teenager, and then we moved around. My dad lived in Manhattan. My mom lived out and stayed in Connecticut. I went to school in Vermont for a few years. I went to Berkeley for a year at Western Mass, went to Hampshire College. So I was like all over the Northeast, but my young years were in Connecticut, like Fairfield County.
And your brother's older?
Yeah, he's 6 years older. He was a big musical influence. I mean, he is a musician, was in bands and things like that when I was growing up. So that was like a big, and he used to take me to shows. He took me to my first like Grateful Dead shows. My dad would take me to see music. My dad's dad played gypsy music, played violin and played piano. And my dad was a musician just for fun. But music was around. My uncle is in the music business. It was an easy thing to get. It was easy for me to get support. My mom was is a painter and an artist. Right. But also an educator, a teacher. So I got a lot of support when I decided that that music was important to me, which is so huge. I mean, I feel really, really lucky to have had that.
The history that I understood of how Soulive came together was that Alan and Neil Evans had put kind of a concept together already, and you joined them. Two brothers had their sound happening already, and then they found this guitar player that worked in the band, and that's how that unit was formed. But on further inspection, I came to understand that actually it was you and your brother who kind of joined that fold, because your brother ran Velour Records, the label that you put out your first albums on. He produced those first albums, and in fact, that label also hosted releases by Lettuce and a handful of other bands in that same universe. So in fact, it wasn't you joining this other family, but it was almost like two families kind of coming together to form this union.
Initially, it really was myself, Neil, Alan, and then Alan's wife, Kim. So it was a very family thing. And also, we had a lot of support from their parents, from Alan and Neil's parents, Willie Evans and Bobby. They were like so crucial. We stayed with them. We actually lived at my mom's house for a while. So it was a very family supported business. And then about a year into it, maybe less, my brother started managing the band and was already like toying with like having a label, and then that the label kind of birthed like around that whole movement that was happening. You know, we were all like playing in New York all the time. I had just moved to Brooklyn. There was a whole little scene happening there, and they had a recording studio that was also like a rehearsal studio on one side, and we all were hanging out there. Like I was producing beats in there for like rappers that were coming through and singers, and we had like a solid little scene. The studio was right next to the World Trade Center. So when 9/11 happened, we all had to scatter. And that was really where that kind of, I mean, it didn't end there, but my brother's offices moved. The studio was over. Yeah. And I kind of set up a little studio for a second in the back of the office. And then eventually I had so many different studios. I was always like setting up my gear somewhere. Like every few months I was setting up a new studio or had some deal with somebody. And, yeah, it was interesting. Then Adam Deitch ended up moving to New York, and he and I were producing records together. And again, it was doing a lot of hip hop stuff. I linked up with the Beat Nuts and Talib Kweli and that whole scene, like the Raucous Records scene, which was like late 90s, early 2000s.
So fresh and so bling, man, doing the damn thing, man. We pack those metal things that ricochet like bang bang. I sling slang for a paycheck with the same tech. And even if I was in a train wreck, I couldn't fall off track. I'm all that, fall back, plow. Hold that, lines is busy, call back. I'm very busy, in fact. All you haters in the back, it's a big disgrace. You need to do like Kanye and fix your face. You buggin', need market, you must be buggin'.
And that was like, it was just really vibrant, you know. There was so much going on. And the funny thing is, though, when I moved to New York, there was also a whole generation of people saying, oh man, you should have been here in the 90s, man. And in the 80s we were running around making, like Will Lee and all those guys, or at Steve Jordan, they were just like making records constantly and making so much money, and all the sessions are gone, man, you know. And then for me it was like, well, now it's like hip hop and all this other stuff's happening, and then now everyone just got studios in their house and all the big studios are gone. And then, you know, really when streaming hit, it was like the whole New York scene kind of ended because people were making records in New York. It wasn't as much film scoring and content and whatever. It was like we were making albums. Yeah. So every studio had like so much going on. I remember the coolest place in New York for so long was Electric Lady. And I got to work there on various projects, but like that was when Voodoo, D'Angelo, and the Roots were in there, and all that stuff was going on. And I kind of like caught the tail end of that, where I got to play on a few of these records. I got to play on the Al Green record that the Roots did, and got to hang around some of that, you know, and kind of see the tail end of that. And that felt like a golden era, you know, now looking back. And it's funny because but then something always pops up somewhere else. I feel like LA has a whole thing too. It's so spread out, so it's not like, oh, everyone's kind of meeting at this one place. It's like all these different home studios, and you know, there's like the Kamasi Washington thing and Thundercat and Wolfpack, and there's all these like, you know, little scenes. So I never want to be the guy saying like, oh, you should have been back in the day, because if you're aware and you're sniffing around, there's always something cool going on. But yeah, it's changed quite a bit. I wouldn't say like that it's gone, that scene. It's just different. My reality became that touring really was the money, whereas for a while it was kind of almost equal, you know, as far as, because I got paid more to produce records and there was more residuals. As that started to dive, I started doing more and more shows again, which is funny because really in like 2005 or 6, I was like, you know, I think I want to peel back from the touring. And right when the record industry started doing that was when my life, I wanted to do more of that, and I wanted to tone down the touring. Of course, I couldn't if I wanted to pay my bills. So it was an interesting kind of battle, and you know, I think I'm still figuring out that balance, you know. And now with kind of like the forced halt to touring, in a weird way, it's been kind of a good exercise for me to like figure out what else I can do, and kind of like test myself on like my other skills, and see what else I can, other ways that I can produce, and you know, trying to kind of get into some new things and trying to do some film scoring and doing obviously the podcast, starting to like figure out video editing so I can create my own content with, you know, beyond just music. It's been a great test. And I do have to admit there's anxiety there because it's like, okay, when will things get back to normal and what will normal be?
That may be the misconception that we all have, that there's a normal to get back to. I think there's a new normal. I think it's got to be a new normal. Yeah. My wife is a yoga teacher. I'm a musician. Like, the two places that I should really be excited to have opening up as soon as possible would be yoga studios and, you know, music clubs. And those are the last two places I would walk into right now, is a crowded yoga studio or a crowded music club. And if I don't want to go in there, how could I expect anybody else to want to go in there?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm thankful, because imagine if this had happened without the technology we have. It would have been way, way worse, and it would have been so dismal. But for me, you know, and I was doing a lot of virtual video concert type of things for a while, and I still am going to continue to do it, but it was depressing, you know, because for me, music, and it's funny that you say those two things, because yoga too, it's like you can do it by yourself, you can do it with a video, but there is kind of it's just a different thing when you're in a room full of people doing it and watching how they do it and watching how they react. And it's the same thing with music. It's just as important for the musician to like receive from the audience as it is for the audience to feel what the musicians are putting out. I don't know, but I know that I don't want to be negative, but like drive-in concerts are not going to do it for me. And like things like that, I don't know. It's probably better than nothing, but again, it's just making me really appreciate, you know, what we were doing and what we were able to.
Well, you also, your career really was, I mean, I know how much production has formed the backbone of so much of what you do and so much of what you've contributed, but the fact is, you know, you built your career on stage. Is that the kind of career that a young band would be able to recreate today?
Wow, yeah, I haven't even thought about that. Building a career from the beginnings right now, I don't even know what to tell someone. You know, well, yeah, that's tough, man. But because I work with a lot of young artists, that's like a lot of what I do, you know, now. And I'm always telling people, you know, create as much content as you can and write as many songs as you can. But
that's not what you did.
Well, I think I put emphasis on that partly because that's not what I did. You know, like I listened to the Lawrence podcast, and I think they have such a amazing drive. In fact, I use them as an example a lot when I'm speaking to other young musicians, because they were able to really do both, you know, like create a live show, create content, do it yourself, build it yourself. Don't go for like the instant gratification, you know, don't go for like I'm going to get a record deal and that's all I need. Because they did get a record deal and they didn't even need it. You know, they don't need it.
That's a real difference, right? Like, if a band like Lawrence is getting a record deal, it's because that label can add value to something that they built already. When a band like Soulive gets a deal with Blue Note Records, that is a complete reorientation of your career. Like, that's like at that time, like a huge stamp of approval. Oh shit, we're like in the soup now. Like, we're here. We're one of these bands.
And that's an interesting, because we also did a lot of work before that, but what I didn't honestly appreciate at the time, looking back, is like what it did for us internationally, and also in markets we hadn't been to. But like, you know, we had toured a lot in the US, and like we already had a following in New York and in certain cities. But after we made that Blue Note record, also, like in Japan, we kind of had this surreal experience where it came out in Japan and was in the top 10, you know, there in like pop music, which was rare all around for anyone. So like we get there and we're selling out venues that we didn't get to, maybe we never even got to in the US before ever playing there ever. So we had this surreal experience where back in New York, we're still in the van. We might have had a sound guy at that point, but we're carrying our own gear. We get to Japan, and it's like, private this and buses and pimped out everything. And we're just like, oh my God. It felt like it not real. It felt like we were in a movie. And I don't know that happens now. Maybe it does. It does more in a pop world.
Did that change your thinking about what you might want for the band? Because, after that, you started to work with more singers. You guys did sort of just set up the conditions so that if there were some pop success there for you, you'd be ready for it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think looking back at it, one of the things for me was that I loved the music of Soulive, and I also loved like soul jazz music, but it was not where it was a small piece to what I was into. You know what I mean? Like when I met them, I was producing music. I lived with this guy named Jeff Basker, who's now a huge pop producer. We were making beats. We were like working with rappers and singers, and like me being a soul jazz guitar player was like not even in the cards for me. Like I didn't even consider myself like a great guitarist, like I thought I was I was more of a producer. I wanted to be a producer.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to make tracks. I played bass, I played guitar. I always felt like I could do enough of each little thing that I could be a producer. And I just started scratching the surface on like what that even meant, and was figuring out what that meant. And then when I started playing with them, I was like, I bought a hollow body guitar on the way to our first rehearsal. I'd never owned one. It was a $50 plywood guitar.
Yeah.
And they had like a jazz chorus. Like I didn't know anything about it. I was like a rock and roll, like funk guy. I didn't really listen to Grant Green or any of that. Like but I started digging into it like from that. I was like, oh, this is really cool. And when I also just saw how virtuosic Neil Evans was, and I was like, man, if I can be in a band with that guy, like, whoa. And then I really I kind of fake it till you make it. I was like there, like just doing what I could, and they had such an incredible ability to play together and had this incredible vibe, and I was like writing songs that kind of did fit that sonic thing. And I started writing songs that could fit, but they had written a lot of songs too. And I just loved the fact, because in the past I had Lettuce, but Lettuce was really, I had to force to make it to happen at that point, because everyone was everyone in Lettuce at that point doing so many other things, and I had to drag everyone to like do it. And this was like, they had a van already. They were like going for it and ready to go, and they had songs, and they were like had a vibe, and they were with suits, and it was like it was so well presented. But after 3 or 4 years of that, I was so happy. I had everything I wanted in terms of, I was in a band with 2 guys that I worked well with. I was great friends with them. We had success, but the music wasn't fulfilling my whole being. You know what I mean? Because it was like this instrumental, and it was like funk, it was jazz, but I was like, oh man, I always kind of wanted to be in a band with a singer, and Soulive had kind of become my whole identity, that I was like, well, if it's going to be everything we do, we need to start infusing like all the other stuff. Like I wasn't sitting in the van listening to instrumental music. I was listening to D'Angelo, and I was listening to Shaka Khan, and so I think it was a culmination of a lot of things that we were like, if this is going to be what we're doing, this is our whole being, we need to like infuse more things into it. But that became complicated, because then if you're going to have a singer but you don't want them always there, it's like, okay, come sing a few songs, but then we're going to do instrumental again, then we're going to do this, then we wanted horns, we kind of wanted everything,
right?
When it started to lose its original identity, it started to lose what everyone loved, that when they came to a Soulive show, they got the three dudes in suits playing organ trio music infused with like hip hop and funk. And as we got away from it, I think it started to affect it, and then we kind of realized one day, as we all started to let ourselves do other projects and do other things, make our own albums, produce other people, we started coming back to it and we started touring less. We were like, man, this is really special, just the three of us playing. We don't need like the horns and the DJ and the rapper and the singer. And I think the best music we've ever made was that, like the last couple albums we've made. Cinematics was an album we made a couple years ago that, again, kind of under the radar, but I think it's the best music we've made. It has like this patience to it, and it has this maturity to it, and the compositions are really cool, and we actually wrote it all together, like in the studio. But I still like the records we made with rappers and with singers, but I think the best Soulive is the three of us in a room, in a small room preferably.
It's interesting though, man, because part of what you're describing is it's sort of twofold. Like one of the things is that when you have a band that has a following and an audience that expects a certain thing from you, you are not only engaged in a kind of dialogue with your bandmates, but you're also engaged in a kind of ongoing conversation with your audience, right?
True.
And as you started to sort of explore other things, I mean, one of the things that you're saying is like, we kind of lost some love because our audience loved this thing and we weren't giving them the original thing that they fell in love with. And the other thing that you're saying is that in this case, your audience might have actually been onto something. Like, if the audience wasn't really sure how they felt about you bringing all these outside people, and ultimately when you guys got back to the purity of the original concept, you realized that, oh yeah, that's right. That is the thing that everybody fell in love with.
Well, I think the other thing is, I mean, it's like the classic, when you're the painter and you're looking at each detail, it's hard to see the painting, right? Yeah. And when you're inside the van and you're seeing your schedule and you're like, well, okay, it was hard at that point to say, listen, guys, I'm going to go produce records for a year. I'll be right back. It was like we had this momentum. We had all these things. So we kind of wanted to make it everything we wanted to do part of this one thing. Yeah. When sometimes it's better if that one thing is that thing and it's just part of your life and I'm so thankful that we're still a band, because now it is that. Now it's like when we want to do a record, we know that what we're going to do. We know we're not going to like bring a huge entourage. It's going to be the three of us and like one other person. We tour lean and mean. We do all the, and then the other thing that we got to do, which was kind of a divine intervention to a certain degree, or whatever you want to say, is that we created this thing called Soulive, where it was like every year we got to do that, but it was a way better concept, because we basically could be Soulive for an hour every night, and then we would every night have a different guest. Yep. And it also got to showcase like the fact that the guys, all of us in the band, could do all these different styles of music and could kind of move with whoever the guest is. Yep. And that really showcased the band in the best light, because it was like, okay, here's Soulive, here's us doing what we do every night. We do one set, and then one set of like, it could be anything from, there was nights where we had Talib Kweli and John Schofield on the same night, and then John Tedeschi and Warren Haynes and Derek Trucks or whatever every night, Questlove, and do a James Brown night with like a horn section and Nigel, and we got to really go everywhere. So I think, and then honestly, once Soulive started happening, we knew that, okay, when we tour, we're going to tour as a trio, but when we do Soulive, like that's the allure, is that people can come see us and doing all these different things once a year, and they got to come to New York, and that's when we do that.
I mean, listen, I hear you loud and clear that that's not all that's on your mind right now, but I'm very curious about that time, and in part because I had a kind of a strange relationship with the whole jam band concept. I guess I came out of like a slightly more jazz-centric headspace when I was coming up, and I loved Soulive.
Yeah.
But then there's a lot of jam bands that I just like never could figure out. And you guys, you know, you had to have one foot in and one foot out.
Yeah.
What did you make of the whole jam experience, especially at the height of it at that time?
You know, the way that I'd say it is, first off, Neil and Al had no feet in jam band. I had like a pinky.
Yeah.
You know, no, but I mean, I'd say our fan base, by all means, was equally, or if not even more so, jam band. But you know, it was one of those things where there was frustration when people would say that we were a jam band. Like, you know, I did go to Grateful Dead shows, and I had some relationship with that music growing up, whereas Neil and Al they didn't get it at all.
They saw it was more like soul jazz meets hip hop. That's kind of where they were seeing it.
They wanted to, they were like, this is soul music. They didn't really like it being called jazz music either, or at least Neil didn't. But, you know, I just wanted to embrace an audience. And to me, the way that I would always kind of like defend that, and really at the end of the day, we were all thankful to have an audience, and we'd rather be playing clubs with people dancing in it than jazz bars with people sitting and golf clapping. And at the end of the day, you know, Neil didn't want to do that either. He didn't want to play the Blue Note or what Yoshi's. We ended up doing gigs at those places on certain occasions, but it was really, we wanted to play festivals and clubs and do that. So that was the best gateway, was being a part of that scene. And we didn't try to be a part of that scene. It just kind of happened. I think when our first album came out, we had seen Tedeschi, Martin, and Wood in that world, and where we're like, oh, well, if they're there, and like John Scofield was kind of dabbling with it, who was my personal like guitar hero.
When I hear that first record that you guys made independently, it sounds to me like you were listening to that John Scofield record, A Go-Go, that he made with Tedeschi, Martin, and Wood.
For sure. I mean, that album is still one of my favorite albums. We were looking more towards, like, you know, when we were in the van driving around, we were listening to Tribe Called Quest. You know, we were listening to De La Soul, D'Angelo, and then we would put on like Richard Groove Holmes, or like things like that, or Grant Green or Lonnie Smith. But we really wanted to make sure there was hip hop in it. You know, that was like, we would listen to A Go-Go and love the compositions and the playing, but our version of that was going to be way more like, there was going to be more kick drum.
Yeah.
There was going to be more smack in the snare. Like we were listening to hip hop. We were all making beats. Like I was in the back, like making beats on like a beat machine, like always. We wanted that in there always. And Neil has just such an incredible harmonic sense, and he's such an incredible writer that like anytime there was like this pool of harmonic genius to dip into, like I'd be like, okay, we got a groove like this and I got a melody, and like he would have like 10 versions of ways to reharmonize under it, and his compositions were mind-blowing to me. And like whenever I would actually like figure out what he was doing, it was like I'd have like a whole, I'd just be so happy that I could get there. And by the time I'd get there, he'd have like a new version of it with like 10 more different changes to it. And I'd be like, But I learned so much just like being around him. And so, yeah, I think a lot of that early stuff was us kind of like also like not competing, but like he would write something. I'd be like, oh man, I got to write something that's as good as that, you know? And Alan also, like a lot of our classic songs in the beginning were Alan wrote. So I think it was the boom bap with like some interesting chord changes was like the formula.
You know, the drum sound is a very specific thing, and sometimes it's so dialed that it actually sounds like a drum machine.
You know, that was a journey. Alan's always been an engineer, and I've always considered myself an engineer, but he definitely knows a bit more than I do. I kind of like find my way there through experimentation. He's a little bit more, you know, he worked on consoles and all that stuff. Right. And we all did. Like, we all were students, you know, and I think like in the early days, he recorded our first stuff, and then we got to work with a bunch of producers when we were on Blue Note and engineers, and we all studied what they were doing. And at certain times, like the album Next, we kind of like messed around with sound replacing, which was like kind of a new technology where we would blend in like fake drums with real drums, and there was times where it worked and there was times where it didn't, you know. But we always wanted our records to like come on. We wanted it to be able to like come on after a James Brown record, but before a Tribe Called Quest record, without having to mess with the dial on your stereo. You know, it's like, okay, the drums can kind of live in this world, but they can kind of live in this world too. So that was the goal. We wanted to put the record on. We wanted you to do this, you know, that more so than anything else. We wanted you to dance. We wanted you to move. The harmony and the melody needed to be hip too, but I think it was the snare had to be popping.
The snare had to be, yeah, exactly. But what you're describing is, like you say, we didn't want to be jazz. We didn't see ourselves as jam. I mean, you were like living in this middle space where I hear that hip hop was informing it as much as anything else.
Yeah.
But one of the things about the jam audience that is hard not to notice is it's a very white audience.
Yep.
And I just wonder what it must have felt like for you guys to walk out in front of those crowds.
You know, we never thought about that too much, to be honest, which is kind of weird because we've talked about it later. But, you know, for us, it was just about the energy in the room, you know. And, you know, I don't know. I feel like what happened in the early days and then what happened later, because like Bowl Live, for example, you'd have a lot of people coming to see the artists that we were playing with initially, and then also coming to see us. But then what I kind of realized after a few years into it was that, oh, well, and I don't know if this was as a result. I would hope that maybe we were a part of a movement that created this result, but the result of the last 30 years is that, like, yeah, there's a black guy or a white guy, but the point is like that a lot of people in the audience that you would expect to like be there for Talib Kweli and then leave for John Schofield were aware of these Go-Go songs, but also knew the lyrics to Kweli's songs, which is like me. That's like, I was like, wow, there's a lot of me here, which is like, I always kind of thought I was an outcast because I liked Charlie Parker and I also liked Busta Rhymes, but that's not that odd, actually, it turns out.
Yeah.
At least not in New York City. And we would see people, and it was like, and also I think that particular series, Bowl Live, there would be more of a cultural mix. But you know, the thing was with Soulive is like we would play, like it was more the venues. Like if we played a hippie fest, it was hippies. If we played like a Chicago, like Double Door, like we would see a mixture of races in there, you know. Yeah. So sometime, or if we toured with like Music Soul Child, and we toured with, I mean, we opened for Aretha Franklin, we opened for Ray Charles. So it was like we caught a mixture of a lot of different things. And I think, you know, Alan and Neil also, that, you know, them having a white mom and an African American dad, like it wasn't really a topic amongst us. It was just kind of, we just did it. It was more, the thing that irked us more was like when people classified us as a jam band. Yeah. Because we would also hear these other jam bands that sounded nothing like us. Like they sounded like these garage bands, like wanting to be the Grateful Dead. And we were so different than that.
What do you think defines jam? What are the values of jam bands in that way?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of that is derived from what the audience, being predominantly white and hippies and whatever, who I love that audience. I think that, and over time I've been thankful for it, because I'd say the jam band audience wants every show to be unique. You can't, if you're playing in the jam band scene, you can't play the same set ever. You can't play, like when we're at Bowl Live playing 10 nights, we have to sit there and start charting out how we're going to never play the same set. And we only repeat a few songs. And I think that community wants to be a part of something different, and they'll come every night. That's the great thing.
Is that some of the legacy of the Grateful Dead, that the Dead would change their set list, and so then the expectation is if you're under this umbrella in any way, we expect you to change your set lists also?
Pretty much. If you are in the jam band world and you start to play the same set, you'll get bashed. In fact, I remember when the Wolfpack guys came to Brooklyn Bowl and they did 3 nights and they hadn't even toured much, and I had been in contact with them and I was going to sit in, but I think I was out of town for one of them, and I sat in one of them, and I let them know, because a lot of the people were like, yeah, I like Wolfpack, but man, they're playing the same thing every night and they got the same shtick. And I'm like, so I told them, I'm like, guys, if you're in this world, you kind of need to switch it up, because if you look out there, the thing is, you guys are selling out these nights, but you know what's going on? Half of these people are the same every night. So when I play with Phil Lesh, we'll play the Capitol Theater for a week straight, or 5 nights straight, or whatever. The first 3-4 rows, same people every night. So you have to understand that they want a completely different experience. And if you are going to play the song again, different, you got to solo sections are different. You got to change it up. You got to do this. This is not pop. This is not Justin Timberlake. This is not. And if you want to build a whole production and make it something like that, that's that's just a different world.
No, but it's also not jazz in the sense that Miles Davis would take his band out on the road. They'd play these tunes for 3 months, and then they'd go in the studio and they would have been playing basically the same 3 sets, so that they kind of had a concept on those songs, and then turn around and get a new repertoire together. And interestingly, I heard in your interview with Schofield on your podcast that he said that he figured out how to play with Phil Lesh because he had played free jazz early on in his career, and he saw those as being related in some way.
Yeah, it is. It totally is. And, I don't know where I lie on it. I've kind of started enjoying that. It's ballsy, man. You got to go out there. When I play with Phil, I can't believe the balls sometimes
of everybody.
Because I'm like, wow, this they're playing in front of whatever it is, 5,000 people every night, and we're calling songs that most of us have never played and only heard once, and you're just gambling every time. But that audience is excited to be a part of this thing that's they're that rub of we could totally fuck up, or it could be amazing, because it's really this pendulum that can go so far in either direction. But the highs are so high, and then the lows are really awkward. There's been some horribly awkward moments on those gigs. But he just smiles at it. Whenever there's a really awkward moment where no one knows what's going on, Phil will, he'll steer us back, but he almost gets off on it, or or either that, or he just knows how to navigate out of it. And I've definitely drawn some of that, because there was definitely tours where Soulive would do a similar set, but if we were playing in the same city or near the last show, we would try to change it. And then the Bowl Live shows, we would that was really a test, and that's when our repertoire just started expanding and got up to 300 or 400 songs that we would play. I dig that. I kind of like both. I also like seeing insanely tight set and a production, and if someone is known for this one record or these two records, I like to go hear those songs. And I think that is really where the line is, as far as jam band versus non-jam band, is you've got to be able to do that. And if you don't have enough albums or repertoire to do that, you have to have a lot of covers and a lot of other things you can do.
I mean, when you were working with Lettuce, were you less concerned about questions like that? Where does Lettuce fit into this conversation?
That's interesting. I think in the beginning they've embraced this more and more over time, and now are more into. It's funny because when I was in the band, I was pulling for that more, and then now that I'm not in the band, they're like barreling ahead with like owning the jam bandness. I mean, because really at the end of the day, the jam band doesn't designate what kind of music you play. You know, so Lettuce's music is funk, it's hip hop, but there's improvised sections, and they're expanding more on that, and they're also changing the set a lot more. Yeah, and now there's enough Lettuce albums that you can play original Lettuce songs for 3-4 nights and not worry about a repeat.
I was in Denver for 2 days in October, and I tried to hook up with Deitch when I was there. I wanted to just like take a little survey of the scene and just find out what is going on in Denver, that it's like the jam capital of the West. You know,
it's weed, man.
It's got to be weed.
No, it was the first.
It's the Nuggets.
It was definitely a huge piece to it. I mean, I don't know. I don't know which came first. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, the weed legalization was ahead of everyone else in Denver. I mean, there's a lot of great venues, a lot of music promoters, a lot of support for music. I mean, I've been to Denver on nights where there's like 5 shows all competing and they all sell out. So the support there is just insane on so many levels.
Yeah.
But it definitely changed a lot, because when we used to tour Colorado in the early days, we would hit Boulder and maybe not Denver. And now Boulder's kind of an afterthought, and we play like 3 nights in Denver or something. So yeah, there's just a heavy music scene, and Colorado in general just like supports. Yeah, I don't know when the flip happened, but weed has something to do with it. That's for sure.
I think it does too. So man, I think a lot of people who were fans of Soulive and sort of knew you as a player, maybe even up until your podcast, I don't know, for me that's what it was, were not aware of the amount of production work and the amount of collaborative work that you had sort of been doing in the background this whole time. What did you do to sort of present yourself as a cat that people would want to have in the room? Because it sounds like a lot of what it was, let's get Kraz in the room. Let's have him in the room while we're writing, while we're putting tracks together, while we're brainstorming. How did that part of your life come together?
That's a good question. I mean, it's been a real long arc because that was what I wanted to do even previous to Soulive, and during Soulive I was doing it, it goes back to me making beats in my room, I was making beats for rappers and for singers, and there was an artist named Wapele that I worked with in college that ended up having a gold record when one of my songs, or 2 of my songs, were on there. And that's when I realized, because I remember getting a check in the mail, and this was something that I was doing completely because she was my friend. I mean, I thought she was great, but I had no idea that record would do what it did. And I remember getting a check from Sony, and I'm just like, oh my God, like this can be a thing. And that was back when I had an ASR 10 and an ADAT machine. I think eventually I had a Pro Tools 01, and it was just something I was always doing. And eventually people would start letting me do stuff. I think Talib Kweli was one of the guys early on that had me do stuff, and people heard that record.
Here we go, like yes, y'all. To the beach, y'all. Ain't no sleep, y'all. To the break of dawn, 5 o'clock in the morning. We keep rocking on. The working people running like the stop clock is on. We got it popping in the meat market. Chicks take a seat, park it by the bar so they can meet the Vic with deep pockets. And them dudes buy them cars and turn them into sweet objects of desire. Big rims on them tires, we finna drop it like it's heavy as hell. The clan of the cave bear used to use a club to hit it, drag it by the hair.
I was just around. I was always around in the studios in New York. I'm trying to think of the first things that I really produced the whole album of. I mean, I was making my own records too, and making I produced a guy named Via Farcature's album, where I was able to get a lot of other artists on that record. I got Dave Matthews and Warren Haynes and Derek Trucks and a bunch of people on that.
Well, just look at me, 'cause I believed. I prayed in that temple down on my knees. I turned my back and felt the knife sink deep. Look at them, they're all the same. Take everything, it's a crying shame, and it might taste sweet.
I don't know. It was just like a very slow burn. The same year I did that, Adam Deitch and I produced a song for 50 Cent.
Yep.
That was on like his second or third album, which was a big one.
See it to believe it. Try and dodge and waving it up a paraplegic. Believe me, it's easy. I hurt you, I murk you, I pop something, drop something. I ain't gonna stop. Hunt, run till you spun. One shot, one gun, 1-9-1-1 emergency. It's murder, be it's excellent execution.
After the success of the 50 Cent album and that track that you did, you actually went out to LA and tried to drum up some production work and maybe tried to get something going.
Yeah, that was an interesting time period. Adam and I moved out here for a little while, just a few months, and worked with Interscope and worked on artist development. We're producing like up and coming artists, but essentially there was a lot of waiting around to meet with people and to do this, that, and the other. And I was still in Soulive, and there was kind of like a big moment where I was supposed to go in the studio, and Dr. Dre was going to meet with me, and this, that, and the other, and I had to leave to go do a Soulive tour. And they were not happy, that I was doing that. And I guess I kind of like had this moment where I was like, well, I have these fans that are actually care that I show up. And meanwhile, these sessions seemed very like they were all going to happen with or without me. You know what I mean? And I just felt the need to be a part of, that I needed to go where people actually wanted me there, and it was a tough time here, like getting into that world, because it was these gatekeepers, and I think if I had lived out here and I didn't have the other things going on, it would have been a different story for me. But I think at that moment too, I guess I just didn't feel totally fulfilled working with, because they basically dictated who I would work with versus. What I do now is like I work with people that I love and that I want to be around, and that the records I believe in, and it's not about just placing a song. I always was weird about that word, like placing a song. I'm like with a random person. I'm like, I don't know. It just took it felt so impersonal, and that was kind of the initial pivot to like wanting to make my own records. And I eventually started my own label and signed a group called the London Souls. I produced them, produced Nigel Hall's album. I started just working with my friends. I started kind of just being like, what, if I'm not gonna work with these huge stars, I'm around all these amazing musicians, I should be a part of their movement and try to get them to that place.
Ooh, baby, give me a sign. I'll make you happy, man. Just let me make you mine. Ooh, baby, give me a sign. I'll give you everything. Just say you'll be all mine. Ooh, I used to act a damn fool about doing anything good for attention. Things have changed, I'm a brand new man, and I don't want you to have misapprehension.
I also feel the difference of what we mean when we say produce, right? Like one thing is, okay, I produced beats, I produced a track, and then that track got placed. And the other thing is, I produced an artist and I produced their record. And, that kind of production is a much more sort of big picture, global, conceptual thing.
One of the interesting things about the title producer is that I can't think of any other job that encompasses such a wide variety of things and variety of roles. I mean, with the London Souls, they were so good that all it really was for me was to get the sounds right, connecting them with being in the right studios, making sure that helping with arrangements of songs. But I was basically a lot of times I didn't have to say a lot, but it was more of like pushing things this way, pushing it that way. And then there's been other times where I've done literally everything. With Nigel, it was like I wrote most of the songs and played a lot of the instruments, and it was just his voice, and so every time it's different.
That's why I think it's so interesting that with your own records, you choose to work with producers.
It's because I don't like being alone. It's something about being alone for like 3 days straight making music. You're like, wait, I need someone to hear this. Also, like working with Jeremy Most, for example, I love his production. It's just like a chance to like learn from someone else and see what they do. And with Otis McDonald too, it's been really cool. And I very much like am co-producer on those things, I guess, like, cause I do a lot of it, but, it's definitely a combination, and it's with people that I really respect, and love. Again, it comes back to me being like wanting to be a band guy. It's like I love working with other people, that excitement and being like, oh man, like that's cool. Like the excitement of being in the studio and creating a song with somebody, it's just, there's nothing like that.
Does working with other producers for your own co-producing, whatever, just working with other people on your own projects, does that influence the way you think about producing now when you go and work with other, artists and bands? Like, just think about what do bands need? What do artists need? And what did I need when I was making my own project?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I take so much from each one. Every record that I make, I learned so much for the next one, and a lot of it is also like influenced by what they want, There's an artist named James the Eighth. We're finally putting out his first single. I've been working with him for 2 years, or maybe even longer, over 2 years. He came to me with some great songs and a great voice, and he can play guitar, but we always joke that it's like Mr. Miyagi and Danielson, because he's been with me. He helped me like build this studio. He helps me with all this gear stuff, and then we'll sit down and get super deep into like what he wants to say. It's been a very deep process to get to where now I feel like we have most of an album, but because when he came to me, he was writing pop songs, and he was on American Idol, and but he wanted to really pivot into like making art, and he played me all these artists that he liked, and I was like, well, the difference is this person's saying something that really is moving you, and like you need to figure out what you want to say. And it took like a year to really find what that is, because he grew up being a Mormon, and he left the church at one point, and when I really got deep into his life and his story, we both kind of figured out that he needed to talk about that, and that was the thing that defined him. We were like, what is different from you from like all, because you're a great singer, you're a good-looking guy, you're a great guitar player. You're going to be successful, but you need to find what really sets you apart, because it's hard, because you turn on your Spotify and you go on your Instagram, there's 5 zillion things that you get every single day, but what makes you stop is when you hear something that really is unique about a particular person that like moves you. And with him, it took some deep dives and a lot of conversations, and that's why I'm like dialing back to doing like 2 or 3 albums a year tops, because it's like I realize the ones that really matter are the ones where we do that, because otherwise they don't need me to you can get good sounds somewhere else, so I think I'm not the producer for everybody. I'm like the producer for somebody that wants to like really like dig and like figure some shit out, and I'm not necessarily just gonna like pull up the sounds that I did on the last record because you liked that record and do that again.
I heard you say when you were setting up your conversation with Don Was on your podcast, you said everybody says he's a vibe guy, and I like that idea. I want to get to that thing where I'm a vibe guy.
Yeah.
People say about Kraz, yeah, he's a vibe guy. That is a dark art.
Yeah, I think he said that specifically, or one of us said that. It's something that you don't, that you can't really explain, but being in a lot of sessions, you get better at it. You know what I mean? I think one of the things too is like making people feel comfortable. I think one of the things also with being a producer is that you can't have an ego that like shadows someone else. You have to be able to say, in certain cases, I've come up with an idea, for example, and kind of made them believe it was theirs. Just to like make the dynamic in the room comfortable. I'll be like, or to make the shift into this new place comfortable, you have to be selfless at times and just be like, okay, this is not about me. This is about making the best record for this person. And when you have, a lot of producers have great musical ability. It's hard to like, when you have that ability to also be able to be like, okay, this is about you. This is not about me. But then there's guys like Puff Daddy and Pharrell, but I don't even like consider them producers. I consider them artists that collaborate with other people. Like the producers that I look to are like Arif Mardin, Don Was, Ahmed Erdogan, like people that were in the room helping create these. A lot of those people don't know those guys. That's kind of the whole thing. Or the fact that you didn't know that, or people didn't know that I'm making these records. I mean, it's a combination of things. One is that liner notes don't really exist the way they did when I was a kid, so it's impossible to know what people have done.
When I heard the Kraz record, the last one, Telescope, for better or for worse, man, I spent 15 minutes trying to figure out who's on that record, and I still can't figure it out. I cannot find liner notes on that record anywhere.
Well, I can tell you everything is Jeremy and myself besides
those vocals.
Emily King and whoever is listed singing. So we played everything. But so it's you're right that it is kind of like a dark art. I don't know. There's not a ton of people that I know right now that are doing it. Because the other thing is that a lot of artists don't understand what a producer does, and they don't understand the value of what a producer brings. You know what I mean? And maybe they don't think they need it, and maybe in certain cases they don't. I mean, I've actually taken myself out of projects because I wasn't needed. There's an artist I work with called Victoria Canal, who's kind of like James. I'm really close to her. She's a young artist. She's amazing. And I was working with her doing production, and then she came to me one day, and she'd been kind of digging down the rabbit hole to figure out her sound, and she played me these two songs. One's called Drama. You can actually hear it on Spotify, Victoria Canal. And she played me that song, and I was like, you don't need me. Like, we can hang out, but your production sounds better than what I did with you because it's super unique for you. You know what I mean? And that's another thing you got to be able to do sometimes. Be like, you don't need me. I think there's times where I'm needed and there's times where I'm not.
I could do without the drama. Oh, I'm a sucker for good karma. Oh, gonna walk away, ricochet, let it fade. Ain't gonna haze me, no. I could do without the drama.
Well, I will say I know Victoria a little bit, and she's such an extraordinary person. In addition to being an artist, that I'd like her to produce my next record. You know what I mean? Like after
that conversation, I actually was like, well, you should produce something for me.
Yeah, totally.
Because she had such a unique take on how she was using Logic and was really like going down the rabbit hole on tweaking her sounds. She just cared so much about it. She was so passionate, and it kind of blew me away. But I think everyone's got their own reason why they're needed. But I think now that everyone has their own studio and their own way to create music, the role of a producer, we're not needed like we once were, for better or for worse.
So why do you still pursue it in that way?
That's a good question. Well, I think what's happening is I'm producing more music for me. you know, and I calling it, you know, who knows what I called one Kras. This next one's going to probably be Eric Krasno. I'll probably make something like right now I think a lot of my future is going to involve projects. Like I'm producing a record with Son Little, and it might be a project we do together. Maybe we call it something else. I have something with Tash from London Souls. I think there's certain times where people see the value in it, you know, like James, you know, there's no doubt that I'm like very embedded in that record. Mm-hmm. And the Nigel record is very much like our album, you know, even though it's him singing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really know. I think that it's also just that I love it so much that I can't give it up. But it's not like there's a ton of money in it anymore. It's basically an investment on the artist's behalf. For them, they think that the record is going to make that much difference in their touring and whatever else, that what I'm bringing to it has that value, because it's not going to necessarily like sell them a ton more records. It might maybe get them a little more press in certain cases.
If coronavirus weren't happening right now, how much touring would you be doing this year?
I've canceled like 100 gigs.
100 gigs?
Already. Yeah. Something like that. I haven't gotten the exact number, but I was booked basically when my wife got pregnant. We were like, okay, well, I want to be around when my son is born, but let's just take I had from February through September, pretty much every weekend was booked, 3-4, and it was like almost 3-4 gigs a week.
And with who?
See, that's the thing, is I have such a weird schedule. So I had some that were myself, Eric Krasno, trio. I was mostly riding with a trio. I had a lot of gigs with Oteil and Friends. That was a lot of it was that. And then a lot of other just different things. I get booked for festivals I'm the musical director on a lot of events where like I help put bands together for events. It was a combination of things. But a lot of it was Oteil. Some of it was Phil Lesh and Friends. But there was a lot of gigs, a lot of festivals. I get added to these festivals as like a special guest, you know, a lot too, to like sit in with people. So a lot of times I'll play with my band and I'll sit in with different bands. Right. And I've kind of carved this weird little lane that it's very different from other people. Like a lot of people, they have one band and they just tour with that band. I kind of like jump around between different things, or I had been doing that.
One thing that I had heard about you from all the way back in the day was that you love sitting in. That even just early days in New York, like you were the guy who was like showing up and ready to sit in.
Yeah, that is kind of true. It's funny because now I don't do it nearly as much. But yeah, when I was, especially in the early New York days, well, it was also just, there was like the Wetlands and these certain venues where I just knew everybody. So I would just walk in the back door and they'd be like, Kras is here. And the band would be like, no matter who was playing, they'd be like, come on up, dude. And I'd like take a solo. And Brooklyn Bowl was like that. So I think it was very much a thing like that. And then, you know, festivals. I was the guy in Soulive, you know, when Soulive would tour, I was always the guy that would like hang out. Like they'd go back to the hotel. I mean, they would hang sometimes, but I'd want to go hang out and check everything out. I'm a fan. I'm a music fan, you know, so it was like anytime somebody was playing, I'm hanging out.
That's what I've heard. But LA is not really like that, is it? Or
no, there's no shows. There's no shows. It's kind of funny. Well, that's why it hasn't changed that much during Corona, because it's like I don't really go out when I'm here anyway. Yeah. I mean, I do. There was certain things. It's more like there's studio sessions and there's hangs. Yeah. But not a lot of shows. It just I honestly, like the Bay Area, there's more shows. Like when I first moved out to LA, I was going up there a little bit more and playing shows up there. But I'm finding out that, or I guess pre-COVID, I was finding out about other different like jam sessions that happen out here. But it was really like I got out here, and when I was here, I was in the studio with people and working on stuff. And I was going to say, like, and when I first moved out, a lot of people were coming to visit me here and working in my studio. It was kind of fun. I moved all the way to LA, and all my New York and East Coast people were coming out here. Emily and Jeremy were here a lot, and I was working with. I've been producing an artist named Kat Wright, who's I love. She's from Vermont, But we were working together out there, and then once I moved here, she like came out here, and I produced her, or most of her record here. We're still finishing that one. But I had a lot of visitors, because I also all of a sudden I had a house, with a studio in the back and a pool, and everyone was like, "Oh, I'm gonna go ahead and Kras's house."
If you could give up touring, would you? I mean, if you could just focus on producing, just be in the studio, would that be kind of the dream?
I think so. I mean, I guess my perfect world would be to tour when I want to.
Yeah.
Like, okay, I have this new album coming out. I'd like to go do that. Or if, I really love playing with Phil. I love playing with Oteil. I would love for producing to be my main thing, and touring to still exist as like an a la carte situation.
I relate deeply to the impulse to interview your friends, have conversations, start a podcast. Yeah. But talk about that a little bit. What has that been like for you during this period?
Oh, it's been great. I mean, on a lot of levels. One is just talking to my friends and talking to musicians, and in certain cases, like getting to learn from people. Like, for example, we've hung out many times, but it's never been like, okay, so tell me about working with Bob Dylan, So I get to do that, and it's okay to do that, and I enjoy these conversations. I mean, in certain people, I'm really like Derek Trucks. Even with Derek, like, who I've known for over 20 years, I learned more about him, during the podcast. And it's been a learning experience for sure. Like, at first I didn't, and it's not one of those things where you're like studying how to do it. As it's just something that as you do it, you get more comfortable, and you figure out how to navigate and kind of, I mean, in the same way as producing, you're kind of like trying to get the best out of it, but without trying to forcefully push an agenda. You're just trying to like create a vibe, like we said. So it's been really fun, and it's funny because now it's kind of becoming a bit of a job, when at first it was just kind of like an idea that was going to be this total side thing for fun. Now it's like, okay, I got to do one every week now. But I've really been enjoying it. And like, one of the cool things, I get so many messages from people and musicians, especially during this time, that have been hearing it and being like, "Oh man, this was I was so inspired by this," or, I also had a issue with addiction, and like, Ivan spoke about that. And it's funny, a lot of the things that I didn't realize were going to have an impact, that did. So it was one of these things where I kind of had one idea of what it was going to be, and it became a whole other thing, which is, I'm very thankful for it though now, because especially with all this time on my hands, I'm like, I need something to do.
So much of what you say I relate to. I mean, first of all, this idea of it becoming a job, most of the time it's still one of my favorite things to work on, is the podcast. Yeah. And even like, I was going to talk to you, so I spent a couple of days, went back down the rabbit hole, listened to a bunch of old records, and started talking to some friends. Just do that and kind of go into that space, and then next week go into another space. Like, there's something really beautiful about those assignments, but then there are those weeks when you have other shit going on, and like you have to like figure out how to get your podcast done,
bust it out.
And the other thing that I'm watching you as you confront it, and I am too, is like that fine line of talking to your friends, because in some ways it's like easier if you don't know the person that well, because at least you have that curiosity of knowing. But like you and Adam Deitch, man, it's going to take a long time for you to learn something new about Adam Deitch in the hour-long conversation that you have with him,
Yeah, well, I think in those cases you try to get, I try to egg him on like certain weird nuggets. How many? I've said nugget more time in the last 2 hours than I have in years. Anyway, but getting those good nuggets, I know where to get those from him, so I try to get those. Like the fact that, like, the story of his parents and playing with his parents. So there's like a plus and minus to it. It's like, I think when you're with somebody new, there's this excitement to learn about all these things, but also if you know someone really well, kind of where to dig a little bit. Because honestly, most of the people on my podcast I know fairly well. And then there's certain people that I've just are like really acquaintances that I am learning more about, and I'm excited about that. I mean, honestly, now that I've had the podcast for a bit, gonna have to start getting people I don't know that well at some point, because I'm running through all my friends. So I'm looking forward to that, though. I think it's a cool journey. Yeah, I mean, it was funny because I originally wanted it to have more structure, and have like, oh, I'm gonna ask these questions.
Yeah.
We'll talk about this. I threw that all away because after a while I was like, I think the best stuff comes from winging it to a certain degree. I think, and like you said, every week I'll go back and listen to records of these of people and learn about them a little bit more. Or if there are other podcasts, I'll listen to those occasionally. But I try not to write a ton of things down.
Oh, yeah. I think the comparison to production or songwriting is really apt. When you're working in a production capacity, it's your job to try to, as you say, bring something out of them and let them think it's their idea, and I think that's like conversation is sort of like that too. Like, just create the space, and then whatever happens. The thing about listening to other podcasts, I'm so on the fence about it. I don't want to know the answer to the question I'm asking sometimes.
No, you're right about that. I just thought of an interesting correlation because, like, you get someone in the studio and you're producing them, and artists generally don't want to go right to the thing they're best at. They want to show you that they're good at something else, right? That's like me going into a session and it's like, I want to sing, I want to play keys.
Yeah.
And of course, the producer wants me to he's like, dude, just play guitar. But if he says, dude, just play guitar, my vibe's going to suck.
Yep.
So if like Corey Henry comes in,
Yep,
and I want him to play my synth so bad, right? But I got to wait till he plays piano for a bit and he's got to go play drums for a little bit. I'm going to have the synth on. It's going to be plugged in. It's going to have everything ready. And then eventually when he feels right, I'm going to hit record. When he gets to that synth, we're going to get a great performance. It's like, you can't say, okay, down was, tell me about the Rolling Stones. You
Yep.
got to like wait till he's there. And then you go, oh, well, Keith, and you met him and blah, blah, blah. So it's like, this. It's like, you got to have your nuggets. I said nuggets again. You got to have like the things you want to get to, but you got to find the right moment to get there, and you got to find the way to weave between these points. It's like, I know we got to talk about this. No, we got to talk about that. I really want to hear about this thing that happened.
Totally.
But you can't just jump right into those things. You gotta find your way to weave.
Totally. No, and fortunately, I have Pro Tools, so I can always cut something out if I need to.
Exactly.
Yo, sorry. This we're just saying goodbye anyway, but I was just going to say, man, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
There he was, my friends, Eric Krasno. Man, did I learn a lot about that guy. He is everywhere. Whoa. As you may have noticed, we got disconnected at the very end of the conversation. I had to call him back quickly just to say goodbye and thank you, and that's what you heard. This is an exciting time for all of us. Strange, unusual, challenging, and, also a good time to reflect and talk to each other. So I'll be back again before you know it, and I promise you that, with another deep dive. Until then, talk to you soon.